Who's your favorite chess player? Whether it's Carlsen, Kasparov, Anand, Fischer, whoever, think of any world champ, they all have one thing in common, they all play the Ruy Lopez opening. It's a really classical, powerful opening that can serve you from beginner to advanced level. It will never be refuted, it is evergreen, and for that reason, so many strong players love it. With that being said, a lot of beginner players are turned off by the seemingly complex nature of this opening. But not anymore, because in this video, I'll break it down, I'll explain everything in the simplest way possible so that you'll see that if you just understand the main plan, the main concept of this opening, everything falls in place and things are getting really simple, and you'll be able to take advantage of this opening and of the fact that you understand it better than most of your opponents. Let's start from the very beginning, and I'll share first of all the most foundational ideas, and then we'll gradually go to more advanced and more interesting things. Alright, so white starts off with the move pawn e4. What's the purpose? Well, in order to start a successful attack, there are basically two preconditions. You gotta develop your pieces, and you need to control the center. And therefore, Ruy Lopez aims to fulfill both of these goals. And with the first move pawn e4, you occupied one central square, and you take control of the other one. So, like, it's really the best that you could achieve with just one move. And in addition to that, of course, you opened up these diagonals for your other pieces, so we are also aiming for development just as well. In the ideal world, if black, let's say, does not do anything to oppose your central influence and play some indifferent move, you'd wish to play pawn d4 and occupy the center completely, and then this is like a little benchmark achieved, a dream come true, we took the center. What's the point? Well, it gives you a lot of advantages actually, because first of all, think of this, if black ever wants to develop their knights, you'll always be able to just push your pawn forward and kick this knight away. So that's already annoying. Also, black can't easily put their pawn in the center because it will simply be captured, and for that reason, if black wants to develop their pieces, they'll have to play a more modest move such as pawn e6, and even though it opens up the diagonal for this bishop, but the other one is now completely locked and it's harder for black to develop it. And it all happens thanks to your space advantage, thanks to you controlling the center, and you have a lot of options here of how you want to develop. Basically, you can develop them however you want, you can move around however you like. And for that reason, getting the space control and getting the center is really essential and really cool. Now, let's take it back and let's start with real moves of the Ruy Lopez opening. For that reason, black plays pawn e5, a symmetric move that also does all the same stuff. Occupies one square in the center and takes control of the other one, and it also simultaneously prevents white from playing pawn d4 and keeping the two pawns in the middle of the board. So for that reason, white plays knight f3, which also develops a piece and once again takes control of two central squares. And actually this pawn on e5 is currently hanging, it's under an attack. By the way, we say that we need to centralize our pieces, but what's the purpose? Why do you need to do that? Why do you need to care? Well, think of this knight. When it was back there on g1, it controlled 3 squares, right? Just 3. And as you moved it closer to the center of the board, it now controls 8. I mean, I did the math and calculated, okay? It's 8. So just by moving the knight one time closer to the center, you kind of made it almost 3 times more active, almost 3 times more powerful. And that's the power of centralization, and that's why you do want to bring your pieces closer to the center. They are more powerful there. Okay. So once again, black does something similar. Black plays knight c6 to defend this pawn and also to take control of one more central square and of course to just develop knight. And here's the move bishop b5, which sometimes feels a little bit complicated for beginners because if you're just thinking about checkmating opponent's king, you'd probably wish to keep this bishop on c4, kind of in the Italian game, right? Knocking to the door of the black's king's residency. And on the next move, already you can possibly start attacking black's king right away. And indeed, if you're playing against a complete beginner, you may win the game just like that. But if your opponent is a little bit more experienced, and he does not have to be a grandmaster, just a little bit more experienced, then this hasty attack will often backfire, because if black, let's say, plays pawn e5 to blockade these diagonals so that the bishop does not hit the f7 square anymore, and after pawn takes, black just goes for the main line, knight a5. Now this bishop has to go. The knight on g5 does nothing, black can kick it off. This pawn on d5 is hanging, black can get it back if they want to, and it's rather black the one who is attacking currently. So this hasty attack didn't really work. Now, I'm not saying this position is too bad for white, but I'm just saying that this hasty attack did not achieve the goal, did not manage to win anything, to checkmate black. So let's come back. For that reason, After a little bit of experiments, people realized that just going after black's king immediately does not really work, and so once again we gotta come back to the two preconditions of the successful attack: development and control for the center. So white says, hey, let me get the center first, let me develop, and after that I'll start a really successful attack. And with that in mind, bishop b5 makes a lot of sense. Black just played knight c6 to control these two squares, and so we're putting our bishop where it hits this knight and put some pressure here, and therefore, first of all, it develops a bishop, it prepares our castling, but in addition to that, it potentially gives you an opportunity to just eliminate this knight and get your full control over the central squares. It doesn't mean you have to do this right away, but you always have this option in mind, and whenever an opportunity arises, you can do that. Also, thanks to this bishop on b5, if black ever wants to develop their light square bishop and they push their pawn forward, they'll create this unpleasant pin on the knight. Alright, so that's the logic behind this move bishop b5, and as you can see, it goes along with white's overall plan, controlling the center, influencing the center in the best way possible, and so counteracting black in trying to do the same. Anyway, black goes here, no, not pawn a5, pawn a6. That's the most classical variation. In addition to that, there are a few other more trendy variations, which we'll also cover in a moment. But let's start from the most classical one, because it's the most illustrative for the purpose of understanding the Spanish opening. Okay, so what's the goal of the move pawn a6? Well, it's just to push the bishop a little bit back so that it is less annoying for black. Now, black doesn't worry about this potential trade on c6, because generally speaking, bishop is a bit stronger than a knight, and therefore this kind of an exchange actually favors black. And it's worth knowing that white cannot win this pawn, even though it's undefended right now, but if white captures it, black plays queen d4, which is a powerful counterattack of the two pieces of white, the knight and the pawn, and as the knight goes back, black manages to get the pawn back, deliver this check, which will force white's king to move and to lose the right at castle. Therefore, white couldn't win a pawn, and it, again, kind of backfired. Now, perhaps white is even in a slightly inferior position. And for that reason, after pawn comes to a6, white just drops the bishop back, keeping all the same ideas in mind, just putting the pressure and waiting for some time to take there maybe, or just to drop the bishop back. But for now, we're just keeping the pressure. We aren't going to trade the knight. What's the idea of black? Why did black had to include this move pawn a6? Well, it's because now, whenever they want to, they have an opportunity to play pawn b5 and to kick this bishop completely backwards. Again, it doesn't mean black has to do this right now, because bishop c6 is not a threat, as we know. This exchange favors black. But if black ever feels annoyed that after moving the pawn forward, this pin will be dangerous for black, black always has this move in mind, pawn b5, and he can't kick the bishop off. So for that reason, black plays pawn a6. Alright, now black just develops, knight f6 develops, and also hits this pawn and controls the center. And here's another interesting question. Perhaps the most intuitive way would be for white to just defend this pawn by playing something like knight to c3 or pawn to d3. But here comes another key idea of the Ruy Lopez. If you remember, just at the very beginning, we talked about the idea that in the ideal world, you wish to occupy the center with your pawns, and you wish to keep this pawn on e4 and accompany it with the other pawn on d4, and then you'll have a complete perfect center and complete domination in the center. And for that reason, white's main plan in the Ruy Lopez is to play pawn c3 and then pawn d4. It's a long-term plan. It doesn't mean you're going to do this right away, but after some preparation, you're going to do that, and that will achieve the main goal, the main target. If you play d4 right away, it does not allow you to keep the pawn there, because black can just take it. But if you prepare it by playing pawn to c3, let me just play some random moves of black just to show you the idea. Okay, if black plays some random moves, and let's say you play pawn c3 and then pawn d4. Now, if black captures here, you recapture by the pawn and you keep your perfect center, right? It's not a variation, it's just an idea, the plan of white. So that's what white really wants to achieve. Right, now let's come back to the actual variation. So for that reason, white does not want to move their knight to c3 because we want to reserve this square for the pawn. So to play c3. Similarly, white does not really want to play pawn d3 because this pawn is aimed to be pushed to d4 in the future, so we don't want to waste time and play d3 first. And so, because we don't really want to defend this pawn, white decides to just do nothing about it and simply castle. It turns out that capturing this pawn is actually dangerous for black, because in the future, if you put the rook on e1, it's going to x-ray a lot along this e-file, and so black can't really win any material there anyway. So white is not worried about this pawn, white simply castles. Black in turn usually plays bishop to e7 just to develop. Another question is, why to put this bishop here, why not to place it to a more active square, c5? Well, if bishop is brought there to c5 instead, it is indeed more active, but again, let's recollect white's main plan is to push c3 and pawn d4, right? So now pawn c3 and pawn d4 will come with an extra tempo of attack of that bishop, and it would just help white. And for that reason, black refuses to play bishop c5 and chooses a more modest, but also a more solid move, bishop to e7. Now, because black also closed the e-file, and black is less worried about potential rook e1 threat, maybe black is ready to capture this pawn actually, and so white defends it by playing rook to e1. Now, since this pawn is defended, actually this renews the threat to black's pawn on e5. If black plays some move, let's say if black just castles, white could actually eliminate this knight, and after that just happily win the pawn on e5. Since your pawn on e4 is defended, black can't get it back, and so you will be a pawn up. For that reason, let's take this move back. Black first plays pawn b5 to push this bishop back, and now they can either castle or play d6, just any normal developing move. For example, pawn d6, which opens up this bishop, potentially, also defends this pawn just in case, and it also creates a positional threat. We know that in the Ruy Lopez, this bishop is really a powerful piece, one of the key pieces of white. It goes along this, diagonal, it attacks a lot, maybe in the future you can put it to d5 if there is an opportunity, and it's a strong piece. For example, in contrast to this, your dark square bishop isn't that active currently, but the light square bishop is really doing a good job here. And so, black now, once this pawn is defended, this knight was freeing to play knight a5 potentially, and to trade this bishop. And as soon as this threat, positional threat, is there, you gotta secure an escape path for the bishop. And you can do it comfortably by playing pawn c3, which is a multi-purpose move. First of all, if black ever goes knight a5 here, your bishop can easily run away. But in addition to that, this just follows your main plan to prepare c3 followed by pawn d4. Now black, let's say, castles, and it looks like, okay, finally we can play pawn d4, all the preparations are made. But usually white still makes one more preparatory move, pawn h3, to stop bishop from coming here to g4 and pinning your knight. White can play d4 right now, but after bishop g4, this stuff is a little bit annoying. There is this pin over this knight. Black also has some pressure onto this pawn, and again, since black can eliminate this knight, this pressure is a little bit annoying. And so, it's not the end of the world for white, but anyway, it gives black some attacking options. And why would you do that? So instead of pawn d4, white just plays the last preparatory move, pawn h3, so that the bishop can come out there. And after that, white is ready, and nothing can stop white from playing pawn d4 on the next move. At this point, there are a couple options, of course, many variations for black, but basically if black plays some random move, let's say bishop b7, just developing a piece, white will play d4 and the goal is accomplished. White managed to dominate in the center, build up this pawn center, and we can say that white kind of won this battle over the center, and from there white will be able to try to transition into the attack. For that reason, usually the main line for black is try their best to control the center as good as they can. And there is the so-called Chigorin variation where black goes knight a5, attacking this bishop, it goes back, we know that it's a valuable piece, we do not want to trade it off, bishop c2, and now here's the real goal of black, playing pawn c5. And black tries to control the center as good as they can. You still play pawn d4, you prepared it so well that now it is indeed time for you to do that, and now you manage to achieve your goal, so you can actually have a little celebration. Yeah, you did it right. Now, which gives you some positional advantage here. In addition to that, you're also attacking this pawn twice, so black has got to do something. Here's time for black to do something about this challenge in the center. Will black trade here, or will black just try to defend their pawn on e5? Usually black chooses to keep defending the pawn, because if they trade here on d4, and after that take it like this, it actually helps white to advance their knight forward. From here it's ready to jump there to f5 in the future, maybe to c6 if this knight goes away. Also, white now has the opportunity to develop their knight normally. From b1 to c3, there is no pawn there anymore. And all in all, white's position looks more active here. This knight on a5 is kind of misplaced on the edge of the board. So trading there on d4 does not solve black's problems. So let's take it back. And that's why usually black decides to defend this pawn by playing something like queen to c7. Black could defend it by playing knight c6 as well, but then it would give white an extra tempo for playing pawn d5 and attacking it. So black does not really want to give this extra tempo to white, and instead of that they go queen to c7. And that's the main line. Now, maybe it was a little bit complicated at first, but I just really wanted you to understand the logic behind every move so that it's not just a number of random moves that you just gotta memorize, but you really understand the logic behind every move, like why this move is the main one, why this move is played. Alright, now let's go to the next phase. So white successfully managed to accomplish the first step of the plan to develop their pieces to also control the center. What to do next? Well, after that, want to transition to the attack. Hopefully, attack on the king side to attack opponent's king. But for that reason, we also need to bring a little bit more pieces into play, because we still have this knight out of the game and this rook out of the game. The bishop on c1, although hasn't played a move yet, it's quite active along this diagonal, so we don't have to worry about it too much. But the knight on b1 is indeed passive. It can't go forward to c3 because it's occupied by the pawn, and for that reason, white moves the knight to d2, aiming to finalize the maneuver and bring it here to g3. Now on d2 it stands a bit awkwardly because it blocks the queen and the bishop. So after knight d2, black does something, let's say bishop d7 to develop. Now this knight goes forward to f1, no, well, it goes back, but the aim is to advance it forward on the next move. And from here, let's say black does something, rook e8, centralizing the rook. Now the knight can finally land to g3, and that's the square that will usually be occupied by the knight. From here it can jump to f5 at some point, or the other knight can go there through h4. And kind of now your position is pretty active indeed. Your bishop is active along this diagonal, you can develop it to g5 if you want, your knight can jump there on f5 at some point, and as you can see, because you have more space, more opportunities to maneuver, now it's easier for you to start bringing your pieces towards the king side and developing your attack. Another typical move to remember is also, if you're ever worried about this rook on a1 doing nothing, you can always play the move pawn a4, open up the a file for the rook, and life's good. Finally, what are you going to do about the center? Are you going to trade here on e5? Or are you going to move pawn to d5? Usually the right answer is to keep out the pressure as long as it's comfortable for you. Like right now, we know that taking on d4 was not a problem really, you can just recapture, right? So you're not troubled by that pressure. And so you can keep it up because it's unpleasant for black. Black always has to keep defending this pawn, and black always has to worry about this. But if you ever feel uncomfortable about this central pressure, you can always do something about that. For example, if black goes knight c6 and you feel that now the pressure to this pawn is just way too much, you can just play pawn d5. And that's also pretty cool. You win a tempo by attacking this knight. You also gain more space advantage on the queen side. For example, where can this knight go? You know, if it goes back to a5, well, it's kind of passive there. Let's go back to, I don't know, d8. Once again, what can you do from there? This square is taken away, this square is taken away. If it goes to b7, fine, but you know, there it's still locked. It can't go forward anymore. So this pawn on d5 gives you more space advantage and, again, more opportunities to develop your attack in the future. So that's the right approach towards the center. Keep the pressure for as long as it feels comfortable. If not, you can trade or better play pawn d5 and gain more space. Alright, thanks for your patience. I know that it takes a little bit of an effort and time to comprehend all that, but it's really well worth it. The Ruy Lopez is a very classical opening and every chess player must be aware of it. Alright, let me now answer some common questions that students often ask me about the Ruy Lopez opening. And by the way, I also plan recording one more video covering common errors in this opening. So if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, consider doing that and hitting the bell so that you don't miss out on the next video that I will release sometime soon. Alright, so here are a couple of questions that people ask me about. First of all, is this an opening for white or for black? Well, white chooses to play bishop b5, which initiates this opening in Ruy Lopez, but if you're playing this position as black, then you gotta be ready to face it, because you don't know if your opponent will choose to play bishop c4 or bishop b5. And if he or she chooses to play bishop b5, you gotta be ready. Now, the next question is, which one is better, you know, the Ruy Lopez or the Italian game where you, again, place your bishop to c4? Well, both openings are completely fine. And, you know, bishop c4 is a little bit more attacking, a little bit more tactical, bishop b5, a little bit more positional, but again, it's hard to say which one is really better. If you're like below 1000, probably bishop c4 is better, the Italian game is better, because it's, anyway, a little bit more straightforward and a little bit easier to understand. But if you're above 1000, then it's okay actually. Both openings are completely fine, and you may just choose the one that you love the most, that you understand more, that you have better results with. Alright, now another question is, what is the Marshall counterattack? Let me show it to you real quick. So the first moves are all the same. We just play the moves which we covered previously. Both sides develop, try to fight for the center. b5, bishop b3, bishop e7. Now white defends the pawn by playing rook to e1. And here's the difference. In the classical variation, black plays pawn d6, just a normal move. But there is also a more aggressive approach, where black castles, and after white plays pawn c3, preparing this move pawn d4, usually it's anticipated that black will take a more defensive approach, play d6, the classical variation, and white will in the future push d4 and gain more space. But black can say, hey, you know what, I don't want to defend, instead of that I want to attack, and I'm willing to sacrifice a pawn for that. So black goes pawn d5, which is a pawn sacrifice. White takes here on d5, and after this exchange, this pawn is attacked twice, and white can win it. So that's the obvious downside of the Marshall counterattack. White just wins the pawn. But there is an upside as well. Black gets more active play, more lines and diagonals for their pieces, so currently they just defend this knight so that it's not taken. After that, white goes pawn d4 usually to open up the bishop to prepare development. Black goes bishop d6, kicking this rook away and also targeting white's king potentially. Rook goes back to e1, and now queen h4 starts this kingside attack of black. It's not the end of the world for white. White can play pawn g3 and stop it, but anyway, there are some weaknesses around white's king, and it gives black some long-term initiative and long-term compensation. Now, among top GMs, this variation often leads to a draw, surprisingly, but for beginners it actually works really well. Let me show this to you. Here I've opened the database of online blitz games where you can see the results with different moves. Here in the right corner you can see the success rate of different moves, starting from the most popular moves. So if we're taking a look at this move pawn d5, the Marshall counterattack, then look at this, it's really remarkable. White won 41% of games versus black won 53% of games, and this is a rare case where black wins more games than white. Usually since white starts the game, white has a little bit of an advantage, and white usually wins a little bit more games than black. And that's true for every other move. For example, the classical variation or any other move, white wins a little bit more games than black. And d5, black wins by quite a big margin, I'd say, more games. So I would definitely recommend that you go for this, because just attacking is always easier than defending, especially on beginner to intermediate level, because your opponents probably are not good defenders, and especially in blitz, it's just great to go all out, attack, and let your opponent think hard and decide how to defend. And there is also one more final variation that I want to share with you, because all the top players played, a lot of beginner players copy that and start playing this as well. It's kind of trendy, but I actually do not recommend that you go for it. I'm talking about the Berlin defense, knight f6. This variation was popularized by Kramnik in his match against Garry Kasparov, and Kramnik won that match, and for that reason people started thinking, hey, if Garry Kasparov couldn't do anything to this opening, then it must be a really great variation, and so everybody else started playing the same opening. Now, black's idea here is just to simplify as quickly as possible. Black is ready to play here knight takes e4. After white goes pawn d4, trying to open up the center, black realizes that taking here on d4 is probably not a good option, because again, white can go rook e1 and attack along this file, so that's not a good option. But instead, black goes for knight d6, attacking this bishop and initiating one more exchange, so black keeps forcing more and more exchanges. Now, if white doesn't want to lose the time, they have to take here, pawn takes. Now this pawn is hanging, so white take it, and now black move their knight away, initiate one more exchange. So on the other hand, there is no reason for white to avoid this exchange, because it forces black's king to move. And at first this position seems advantageous for white, because black's king lost the right to castle, it's an open file, looks like you can attack it, but considering that it's an endgame, the queens have already been exchanged, you cannot really develop a strong attack anyway. Black's king can always just go back to e8, and there is nothing white can do about that. And because it's a dry endgame position, black has a lot of drawing chances here, and most games on pro level are ended in a draw, and that's the reason why basically take Carlsen, Caruana, Wesley So, any top player, they all play this opening for black, hoping basically to get a draw. But I do not recommend that you do that. Again, a lot of players just repeat what Carlsen and Caruana, etc. does, but I don't recommend that you do this for a beginner to intermediate level player. It's a dry, a bit boring position, and I think you should pick something more interesting, more complex, perhaps more attacking. So I would not recommend that you play this with either color. And again, I'm going to launch a video soon where I'm going to share with you how to punish black for trying to go for this line and trying to play this dry variation. So again, just subscribe, and fairly soon I'll share some really interesting options and much better alternatives for white. If you have any questions about anything that I didn't cover in today's video, feel free to drop them in the comments down below the video. Also, in today's video, we covered the strategic side of the Ruy Lopez opening, but this video also covers the top 5 opening traps in this opening, the Spanish game, and it's a good add-on. Finally, if you wish to elevate your strategic understanding overall, which is very useful for the Ruy Lopez opening, you're welcome to attend this free masterclass. Keep crushing it, talk soon.